basically, we're just going to do today is try and understand the various dimensions and principles and literature material that exists out there on sustainable development. We're going to talk about key constituent elements, principles of ST principles, and some frameworks that we might also use for evaluating sustainable development progress. And then we'll end the day with a small clip from a video which I hope not many of you have watched. And then hopefully we'll have some time left for deliberation. Okay. Sustainable development, to my understanding, is, and something that's really important for all of us to understand, is that it is not an end in itself, it is a process. It is a process which is constantly evolving, and therefore its meaning and its interpretation and conceptualization keeps changing with time. It keeps changing with who is interpreting it and what are the needs of that party which is interpreting it. So the debate over the phenomenon is ongoing. It is never ending, where the purpose of the journey, it's not to reach a particular destination in itself, but the purpose is the journey itself. And I'm happy to provide you these copies of these references later, should you want some. These are all from my PhD thesis, so I'll have to dig my very, very old folder somewhere. Sustainable development is an amalgamation, to that extent, of moral and cultural issues with interacting with economic and environmental problems that exist within the broader contemporary society which we inhabit. The idea is to focus on each of those economic, ecological, institutional elements while not losing the bigger picture, which is the journey and not the outcome per se. These are all borrowed from the literature. It comes up, the more you read about sustainable development, there's a different interpretation to the same dimensions. Sustainable development, according to this particular set of authors, is they say that it has three key dimensions, and they categorize them as analytical, normative, and strategic. Analytical is the one that deals within the social fabric of current ecological and economic activities. Normative, as the name suggests, are those which deal with norms of justice, equity across class, gender, race. Futurity, which includes intergenerational and intragenerational equality. Whereas the strategic, again, as the name suggests, is more to do with institutional dimensions to sustainable development, governance, and how political organizations deal with sustainable development and how they strive to achieve sustainability. Sustainable development is therefore rooted in multiplicity. Multiplicity across scales, so local, regional, national, international, across several varied domains, such as social, economic, cultural, institutional, and like in the previous slide, different interpretations. So interpretation of sustainable development from a local community perspective would be quite different from how the national governments do it in different countries and regions. And because of its underlying multiplicity, it's quite complex, and it's a multi-layered phenomenon as such. And a number of these characteristics about sustainable development can coexist and can result in sustainable development being interpreted as a suite of interrelationships, which can be any of these types, hierarchical, tetrahedron, which can be arranged in a tetrahedron or a prism or a cyclic manner, and you'll know what I mean in a minute. So a hierarchical structure of organizing sustainable development principles is one. We assume that one particular aspect of the picture is more important than the other. So for example, here in these two diagrams, it's essentially the three same or similar components, but organized in a different hierarchy. And that will mean a lot, that will mean different interpretations from whoever is doing that. However, the foundational element across both these models are the same, which is the society and the ecology. So economy really is controlled by what exists around us and how we manage that environment. This is a non-hierarchical representation of sustainable development. So there's no implied hierarchy among all of its 4 elements. Each index is equally important. And where inside the tetrahedron we point just possibly directs us to whether we are paying a bit more emphasis on the socio-institutional or the environmental or the ethical component. Because of the non-hierarchy in the diagram there, as proponents of this model suggest that it's more sensitive to the multidisciplinarity and the complexity that's underlying sustainable development. This is another way of representing sustainability or sustainable development. It's just a fancy way of talking about the same elements, but calling them differently. So the ecological components come under the nature tab. Institution is the society, is the political and the governance elements. Mind is where we talk about our social capital, as we'll talk in a bit. It's more the social knowledge and the worldview that exists around us. Artifacts are what we create, so human-made assets and economy. Again, because there's no hierarchy implied in the model, it's more open to multidisciplinarity and complexity. This is personally something that I think conveys the same meaning in a better way, because it's cyclical and therefore it highlights the evolutionary nature of the concept, and it underlines again that what goes better or wrong in one element actually can be the cause and the effect of disorder or progress in the other. So it's more evolutionary and iterative in that sense, and which is all sustainable development is about. Okay, so and I know many of you are already aware of the ideas of weak and strong sustainable development, but it's just to reiterate here because it has its own implications from a mining industry point of view. Weak sustainable development is where we argue that natural resources can be substituted as long as the total aggregate stock remains the same. So, for example, we could mine and create steel, which helps build cars. I don't know whether that's sustainable or not, but is a different point for debate altogether. But the idea is that we can try and maintain the stock in total, and which is why weak sustainable development is prone to a lot of criticism from a lot of quarters. And there are countries which are doing good in managing that sort of an arrangement. For example, countries, including Australia, which have wealth funds generated from mining, such as Norway and Australia, where if you're mining, you create a wealth fund that's for 10 more generations to come, and use that money to do their own development and plan their own development. But strong sustainable development is where they argue that there are some elements in the environment that we inhabit that are not substitutable at all. For example, and each natural capital has its own value, and you can't necessarily equate monetary value to a natural capital. Ozone layer being the biggest example, which we have seen depreciate in our own lifetime, and people say that there's no way you can value or attach a monetary value to ozone layer. So that's a strong sustainable development concept where capitals across the paradigm are not really substitutable. So that sort of concludes a little bit about giving you an exposure to various characteristics and principles that underlie sustainable development. This is more, how do we bring all of those elements together in a framework that we can use either to assess the performance of our own plans and policies, or just consolidate all the knowledge and track progress towards sustainable development. The first one there is, we'll talk about all of these in a bit more detail, but the first one there is more industry-focused, which certainly is of relevance to us. It talks about the 3 key pillars of sustainable development, so to speak, and then cross-pillar integration as well, which is really good. The natural step is more rooted in scientific knowledge and more rooted in the laws of thermodynamics, and therefore I thought people from JKMRC and the other technical sort of field will be able to identify better with that. ABCD is our own CSRM home-based framework, which I think is fantastic. 5CAPS approach, again, lots of people here I'm sure will know. And then more mining industry-focused principles from GRI and ICMM. And the final framework there is actually is not so much a framework to bring together knowledge, but is more a framework to evaluate how we are doing towards reaching our goals, if you like, towards sustainability. All right, let's talk about them. From an industry point of view, again, there are environmental, economic, social. Each of these three categories you can have a zillion characteristics or indicators further under each of those three broad categories. This is just one example from one framework that exists out in the literature. And the really interesting thing about this is because it helps, from an industry point of view, it helps with multi-objective decision making. And when we talk about multi-objective decision making, the decision makers here could be people all within the one organization and trying to make a decision to make their organization sustainable, or different decision makers, different stakeholders coming together to then achieve a common good. In case of a mining industry, a community. So it allows multiple objectives to come together and integrate those objectives to progress towards sustainable development. And you can create metrics or targets and indicators for each of those components to then track progress on how you're going towards and how sustainable your practices really are to achieve what you want to achieve. Like I briefly said, it provides basic principles for sustainable development. It's rooted in thermodynamics. It talks about the first law of thermodynamics, where there's matter and energy remain the same. They can take varying forms and shapes, but essentially nothing goes in and nothing goes out. And the second law of thermodynamics, which talks about entropy and disorder. And so it's basically, the reason I have it there and I decided to have it up there is because it applies the principle of backcasting, where unlike most frameworks where you say, well, that's where we want to go, this one says that's where we want to go, but how do we get there? So it's more not just what, but also how, and therefore it talks about backcasting. So they create a vision for the future that's sustainable according to them, according to their interpretation, and then they move back and say, well, how do we get there? So let's break it down. Let's break our objective down in multiple steps. So which is why they create a 5-step hierarchy, and that brings in a range of strategies, tools, and plans to get to the final objective in the future. It was created by a scientist, a Swedish scientist, Carl-Henrik Robert, which is why it is more scientifically orientated, more. And they realized at the time back in 1989, when the framework was first established, they did not have many social scientists along. It was more a natural science orientated team. But then as they applied it in varying contexts, one of their biggest buyers of this framework is IKEA. And IKEA was the first one to point out that, well, you don't have socially orientated principles. You have a lot of natural science going on there, but the application of those natural science principles on the ground is lacking because you don't have the social support to it. And that's when they expanded their horizons and they brought in social scientists. So it's really interesting. I've got the link there for any of you who might be interested to have a look. The third one is the ABCD framework, which is the asset-based community development framework. It focuses. It's basically starting point is undertaking a journey of social investigation. So it identifies what exists, including collective and individual strengths. It then identifies strategies to overcome dependence on external factors. So it identifies strategies to enhance self-reliance at a community level. And in order to do that, it focuses on articulating their own needs and what they need from an external party, which is quite interesting because often the external party comes along and says, hey, this is what you need. But this model focuses on the community to identify their own needs. And in doing that, by showcasing their strengths and not so much limitations, it helps address power relations, which are often an important building block when it comes to sustainable development in a mining context, because obviously power relations can be quite skewed across company and community. And then it helps build long-term relations and collaborative arrangements between people who are internal to that decision-making process and people who are outside of it. There's a paper from Deanna and John, who were the creators of this framework, and I'm happy to send you a copy of that as well. So so 5 capitals is one of the frameworks of sustainable development that's most, I think I can take the liberty of saying it's the most commonly used framework over time at SMI, which is good, because now we've got a great depth into exactly what it does and what it doesn't do. As you can see, it consists of 5 key categories there. It's natural, human, social, manufactured, and financial. The idea or the premise for coming up with this model was to move beyond the economic understanding and say, well, there are other capitals or other issues that need to be considered or taken into consideration to be able to achieve sustainable development, at any scale, whether it's community or organization or government. And at the same time, there are some critics who say that everything at the end of the day is still extrapolated into monetary terms, if you like. It's still capital that you're using at the end of the day to define every resource there, and therefore we've not gone too far from where we started. So there are both sides to the debate. Natural capital is what exists already in the environment. So that's the ecological services, the resources. Mining is inherently linked with natural capital. Human capital is the knowledge and skills that we humans have, and therefore and using that capital, we can thus shape natural capital in whatever way we want. Social capital is our networks and connections and links. So it could be an association of members from community and outside community. It could be an organization like ICMM, which brings all the industries together, all industry partners together. So it can be any association of like-minded or not so like-minded people, but at least there's value in that connection. So that's the social capital. Manufactured capital is also oftentimes called built capital, which is the infrastructure that's built around us using human capital, social capital, or natural capital. So that's the technology, or people are talking about remote mining these days. That's form of natural capital. Manufactured capital. And then finally, there's the economics that underline all of those mining-related tasks, which is the accumulated power of all the above capitals in monetary terms. And that decides in a way decides, sadly or happily, what and how each of those capital interacts with another capital to result in sustainability or sustainable development. It's not the most important capital, as we would all know, but it is surely one that speaks a lot in the mining world. And the idea of all of those 4 natural, human, social, and manufactured capitals was to make sure that each of those components are equally well regarded, and that the financial capital can just bring those 4 elements together, but not dictate how those 4 elements work. I'm not sure how much of that we've gained through time yet. It is often criticized, and it's not considered an ideal framework to work with. But as they say, there's not very much outside of this one that we can use and use, and talk. And I think the good thing about this framework is that it allows you still to measure everything. But like you said, there are values that we still cannot measure, that environmental values, justice and equity, and all of those ethical values, you can't just equate them to a monetary amount. And therefore, that's where it fails. But until we can find something else that helps us, at least it's helping us propel in one direction. And it's also interesting how for 3 years that I've been giving this lecture, every time we get going in terms of discussion on this one, because people do react to it in a number of interesting ways. And yes, and it's not, like I said, it's not ideal, but for lack of any other ideal frameworks, at least to our knowledge, I'm sure there are others out there, but we just don't know about them yet, or they're still in someone's head and not published yet. Okay, this I think Glenn mentioned briefly this morning about, these are the 10 principles underlying ICMM's approach to sustainable development. As you'll notice, they are quite broad, sweeping statements, principles, but they touch on all of those issues, all of those characteristics of sustainable development that we've discussed in the last half an hour, which are about ethical business practices and sustainable development considerations at the corporate level, respecting cultures, health and safety, risk management, ecological or environmental performance, conservation of biodiversity, reuse, recycling, and that's coming back to the laws of thermodynamics and weak and strong sustainability, community development, transparency. So it's all, but so it's very broad, but each of those principles can be deconstructed further, and ICMM has done that, into exactly what you should be doing to be able to adhere to that principle of sustainable development there. So this is basically just to let you know that there exists something that is relevant to the mining industry, and you might want to have a more detailed look at it at some stage. This is the evaluation framework that I mentioned. It's more to understand, well, we know what we want to do, and we know how we want to do, but are we doing enough to get to where we want to get? This has two key components. There's a process component and there's an outcome component. The process component really talks about how are we going to get to sustainable development or sustainability, if we consider it as an ongoing process. Who is getting involved? Are we making decision? Are we making decision for everybody, or are we involving people? Are we giving people the opportunity to tell us what they need and what their priorities are? What is the nature of institution-level efforts in planning for sustainable development? Our strategies and plans and programs, are they diverse enough? Are they flexible enough? Do we have multiplicity of ideas there? What is the extent to which we are involving local knowledge? So this is more related to how are we doing what we are doing. This is again, coming back to those 4 or 3 pillars of sustainable development. This is more in terms of, if we follow that process, if we follow that route, can we get to outcomes that are sustainable? And the premise for this framework is that if we can follow the process religiously, if we can tick all the boxes for how a sustainable development process should be, it is likely that we will have effective sustainable outcomes. So that's pretty much to evaluate performance towards sustainability. You could always break the process down into what are the key components of, that, for example, looking at the social contribution. So if you're looking at social contribution, how do you define? Can you create a matrix or a set of indicators that define social development or social contribution? In that would include, who is involved, what is the nature of their participation? Is it tokenistic participation, or is more than tokenistic? What kind of participation is it? Have our sustainable development plans been adapted to local knowledge? Are we taking into consideration what local needs and priorities are? So you can adapt this framework into any setting, and you can achieve what you want as long as the planning into making this process is clear. As long as you have in your head as a planner or as a community development expert, what do you want to do? And then you lay out the ground rules for it. And I think to a large extent, these outcomes will define what goes in the process. So if you're talking about the social-cultural contribution, what defines social and cultural elements to that plan? So I personally think you can adapt to. I had a friend who adapted this framework to look at the environmental management system in Sweden for his PhD thesis. So it's pretty flexible in that sense. You can do it for social, environmental. what is our take-home message from this very quick brief? You can do PhDs on sustainable development as a topic. I did one for sure. So the idea is that you can have as many interpretations of sustainable development as you like, which is why it is interesting, which is why people call it an oxymoron, because they say you cannot have development that is sustainable. I disagree. But the idea was, for this first half of the lecture, was really to open you up to different interpretations of sustainable development as they exist in the literature, to open you up to a number of frameworks that exist. You might want to draw strengths from some of those frameworks and apply them to your thesis or your space in which you work. Some frameworks, and each of those frameworks has limitations. Each framework has its own strengths and limitations. The idea is for you to know and then see which ones work for you better. I thought this was good. I had it on my computer when I was doing my PhD. I think I agree with it. It says when you rely on one author, it's plagiarism, but when you rely on many, it's research. So you're doing research, I'm sure of all of you.